Hey, what's up guys? This is Gary and I'm here today to bring you Hot Boys Garage episode 13 where we're going to do some brake stuff. Specifically, I'm going to show you how to tear down and rebuild a dirt bike master cylinder and a Brembo P32F brake caliper. These are the brake calipers that a lot of ATV drag racers use because they're a nice dual piston caliper. They're light and they usually work pretty well. And from the OEM, you'll find that sort of brake caliper on Ducati Monster street bikes. And then lastly, I'll show you how to prime and bench bleed the whole assembly so that you can check and make sure your rebuilds worked. Okay, so let's get into it. For this video, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you guys know how to remove the master cylinder from the bike. But just a quick overview, it's over here on the bottom right side. You'll need to disconnect the brake lever from it. For stock bikes, you'll probably have to remove the brake light switch here. And then before removing the master cylinder from the bike, I'd recommend going ahead and removing the brake line banjo bolt at the top. Then you can remove the two bolts holding the master cylinder on, and after the rebuild, if you're planning on bench testing it, you'll want to remove the line and reservoir, which for Honda TRX 450Rs, the line runs up to the top of the subframe and mounts here. The 450 dirt bike master cylinders are another popular option. They're a little lighter and more simple in design. There is no external reservoir. To fill those, you simply remove the two top bolts here and the brake fluid goes directly into it. Now, one of these dirt bike master cylinders is what we're going to be rebuilding today. Specifically, I think it's from like a 2010 Honda CRF 450R dirt bike, and the reason I'm rebuilding it is because it failed at a race, and luckily I had a spare one that I was able to quickly swap out and not let that ruin my race weekend. But what ended up happening was there was a lot of dirt that got up in here in the bottom in between the external plunger assembly and the internal plunger assembly. A whole lot of dirt got up in there somehow, and the internal plunger kept sticking, so the brakes would lock up or there would be no brakes whatsoever. And so that's the reason for the rebuild of the master cylinder today. And then again, the brake caliper that we're going to be rebuilding today is one that is similar to this one. It's a Brembo P32, and a lot of times the reason for rebuilding these is that the pistons on either side of the caliper end up getting dirt in between them and the caliper body, and they'll lock up and not want to move. Or I've actually had the problem where I'll bleed the brakes, be able to get pressure, everything's fine, and then a few days later I'll come back and there'll be no pressure at all. And then when I go to rebleed them, I find that there's air in there. And then what I found out to be the cause of that problem, while pumping the brakes, if I took a flashlight and shined it on this seam here where the two halves of the caliper meet together, I could see fluid moving back and forth in there. And there is a passageway for brake fluid to be able to transfer between the two halves, but you're not supposed to be able to see that. And you know, that's with these screws over here being tight and everything. And so that was kind of a problem. And then when we get into rebuilding this guy, I'll show you what I did to fix that. All right, now let's get started. Okay, so real quick, let's talk about what we need in order to do this. First off, you need a clean workspace. Obviously, you'll need your master cylinder and brake caliper, some extra towels or paper towels. I'd also recommend some halfway decent rubber gloves to keep the brake fluid off of your hands. You may need a small hammer and a small punch. This brake piston tool really helps in making removing the brake pistons real easy. A couple different sizes of snap ring pliers, a couple different sizes of needle nose pliers, an assortment of flat and Phillips screwdrivers, as well as some dental picks. You also need a ratchet, and depending on your master cylinder and caliper, you'll probably need an assortment of metric and standard sockets and Allen caps. Having some metric and standard box-end wrenches available would also be a good idea too. Having a flashlight will come in handy, plenty of brake clean to clean things out, some .4 brake fluid, and then some Teflon tape or some pipe dope is also recommended for the bleeder. And then this is optional. If you kind of want to glue your caliper halves together, you'll need some of this 3-bond 1184. If you're rebuilding your master cylinder and or caliper, you'll need a rebuild kit for each. For the master cylinder, I've got this all balls kit. This is the first time that I'm using this brand, so I'm hoping for the best. And then for our Brembo caliper, the kit that contains the seals and the O-ring for that are getting harder and harder to find. I think there's a few places over in the UK that still carry it that you can order it from, or you might be able to check eBay for those. When you rebuild your brake caliper, replacing the brake pads is always a good idea. Pick up a new set and make sure you get the right brake pads for the type and the material rotor that you've got. And then lastly, both of these pieces are optional here. If you want to bench bleed your master cylinder and caliper, you'll need a brake line, and then one of these Medivac automotive bleed kits makes bench bleeding or bleeding in general really quick. These things are pretty awesome. You can pick them up at Harbor Freight. I think that's pretty much it for tools, parts, and pieces, and we can get into the meat of the episode. First up, tackle our master cylinder rebuild. So for dirt bike master cylinders, go ahead and remove these two 7mm bolts here on top, and then there's usually a a little plastic piece that stays inside there. Then the rubber diaphragm comes out, and that's usually followed by some brake fluid. Next up, we'll come down here to the bottom. We'll pull this rubber boot down and out of the way like this. And then up inside here, hopefully you guys can see that, there's a snap ring we're gonna have to remove with some snap ring pliers. Okay, those were too big, so I'm switching to my smaller channel lock snap ring pliers. Okay, now with the snap ring out, this whole bottom plunger assembly come out. That'll leave just the internal plunger assembly inside of the master cylinder body. It should be already protruding out of the bottom like this. You should be able to use some pliers to gently pull it out the rest of the way. There's our plunger, both seals, and the spring. Come up here to the top where the brake line banjo bolt threads in, and you want to take a pick or a small punch, something like this, and put it down through here and gently coerce the spring and plunger out of the bottom. And then once you get it started out of the bottom, you should be able to use some pliers to gently pull it out the rest of the way. And just a word of caution, whenever you're trying to get the plunger and spring out, make sure you take your pick or your small punch or whatever you're using to try and push it out, kind of feed it in at an angle. Just because the hole in this thing for the fluid to be pushed up through is kind of off to the side, it's not directly in the center, so you don't want to damage the master cylinder body. So that's it for disassembly. I'd recommend going ahead and taking the master cylinder body outside, taking some brake clean, spraying it out, cleaning it out really well, and then use some compressed air on it afterwards to blow everything out. Next, take the plunger and spring, go ahead and clean them up really well with brake clean, and then it's time to go ahead and start disassembling this guy. Spring will come off first, then you'll take both rubber seals off, and then depending on what sort of rebuild kit you get, hopefully it'll come with 2 new rubber seals and a new spring, and we'll install those exactly how the old ones come off. Okay, here you can see the old stuff at the top. That is the old spring and the old seals, plunger in the middle, and then the new spring is kind of larger, and the new seals at the bottom. And then I don't know if it's going to show up on camera or not, but the rubber seal that has kind of the indentations around the rim of it goes on the side of the plunger towards the spring. Make sure you lube everything up pretty good with some .4 brake fluid, slip the seals on, and then put the spring on the end of the plunger. Now we've got our new seals on the plunger and our new spring on, so we'll lube this up really good with some brake fluid, and we'll lube our lower body of our master cylinder up really good with some brake fluid, and we'll push the plunger, spring first, back up inside of the lower master cylinder body. Now you can take this outer plunger assembly, clean it up, spray it off really well with brake clean. A lot of your rebuild kits will come with a new snap ring and a new outer dust seal. You can go ahead and replace those if need be, and then after that it'll be time to install this back into the master cylinder body. The new snap ring will go back up in there just like the old one came out. Just make sure you get it seated fully in there. Then the dust boot go back up inside the body, and I'll usually just try and use a large flat screwdriver to gently push it up in there to where it's seated where it needs to be. The rubber diaphragm will go back in next, followed by the cap with this little plastic thing in here, and then the 2 screws. And that's pretty much it for our master cylinder rebuild. Okay, next we'll tackle our Brembo P32 caliper rebuild. First step is to remove the bleeder. So for this particular caliper, use a 7/16 wrench, counterclockwise, loosen it up and take it off. And between that being removed and the banjo bolt for the brake line being removed, you'll probably have some brake fluid down in there. Go ahead and flip it upside down on a rag, get all the brake fluid out that you can. Next, we're going to want to remove this pin that runs through both brake pads. And on the one side, there's a little clip here, and you either want to take a small flat screwdriver or a pair of needle nose pliers and pop that off of there. Make sure you don't lose that. Now with that clip off, you take a small hammer and gently tap this pin back out the other side as far as you can get it. Once you get it so far, you may need to take and use a small punch to push it through the rest of the way. Make sure you do this gently so you don't damage the caliper body. Now with the pin out, this metal retaining clip can come out of the top, and then both brake pads will fall right down out of the bottom, and you'll set those aside. Next, we'll remove the 2 bolts holding the 2 halves of the caliper body together, and to do that, we'll use a 6mm Allen. With both of those bolts removed, you should be able to split the caliper in 2. Note that when you do, there's a passage between the 2 halves. You can see them both here. I'll circle them in the video now. There's a small O-ring that looks like this that goes there. Don't lose that, because if your rebuild kit did not include one of these, you'll need to reuse this O-ring. Now we need to get both pistons out of the caliper, and to do that we'll use this brake caliper piston tool. And how that'll work is we put this part inside of the piston, squeeze together so that the tool spreads out, and the harder I squeeze on this, the more pressure or tension it's going to put on this piston. We should be able to squeeze this and work the piston out. Might need to work it back and forth a little bit, should come right out, and then there's probably going to be more brake fluid behind find it. So have a rag ready. Next, inside of each caliper half, we'll need to remove the 2 seals. The smaller outer one, you can see here, and in the video I'll put an arrow. There's a small one and a large one. We use a pick to gently remove those. Definitely note the location and orientation of each so that you can get your rebuild kit and put the seals back in the correct way. Okay, here's a quick shot of everything disassembled. At this point, I'd recommend cleaning everything really well with some brake clean and then blowing everything out with some compressed air. If you're planning on reusing the O-ring or any of the seals or the pistons themselves, inspect everything for wear, rips or holes or tears or any issues. Okay, once you've got everything cleaned up, it's time for reassembly. The 2 seals will go back in the 2 halves of the caliper first. The larger seal will go here, and then the smaller seal will go here. Make sure you lube up both this area of the caliper and both seals really well with .4 brake fluid. Now, with both seals installed, make sure you lube everything up again with .4 brake fluid, both in here on the seals and on the piston. And it'll be time to press those back into the caliper halves. And to do that, you'll want to square them up and firmly push down till they're all the way in. Okay, now with the pistons back in, it's time to put the O-ring back here, mate the 2 caliper halves together, and bolt them down tight. Earlier in the video, I talked about an issue with being able to see brake fluid moving back and forth in here, in between the 2 halves. If you've got an issue like this, or you're concerned that your halves aren't machined completely flat, what I like to do is use some of this 3-bond 1184. It's a liquid gasket, gray gasket maker, and I'll put a really thin coat of that between the 2 half mating surfaces. And again, I just put a very thin coat on one side, try to keep it away from the bolt holes and the O-ring as well. So I'll usually put a thin coat of that on, lube up the O-ring with some .4 brake cleaner, place it down, mate the 2 halves together, keep them tight with my hands, feed the bolts in and bolt them down. Okay, here are our halves mated back together. Got the bolts in and through. Make sure you get those very tight. And our next step is going to be to install brake pads. The stock sintered metal brake pads are good and work well if you've got a steel rotor. But if you're running a titanium or aluminum rotor, I'd recommend picking up some organic brake pads like this from EBC. They seem to do a lot better on aluminum and titanium rotors. That said, we're going to open these up and put them on. The brake pads will face each other, go up through the bottom. This little clip will sit on top, and then the brake pad retaining pin go through the body, through both brake pads, and over top of that little metal retaining clip. With the pin all the way through and out the other side, you can reinstall the retaining clip, and it'll look like that. Last step will be to reinstall our bleeder. Now for this guy, I usually wrap some Teflon tape around the threads a few times to make sure I get a good seal, or I think you can also use some pipe dope on this. If you want to test out and or bench bleed your newly rebuilt master cylinder or brake caliper, these automotive test and bleed kits are pretty awesome. You can use these things to test a lot of different mechanisms on your vehicle, but for brake bleeding, this here is kind of what we have to set up. And I'll show you guys this convoluted mess I've got here to bench bleed this entire assembly. So first, I've got our master cylinder here. I've just got it blocked up with 246 and 123 blocks, so it's sitting straight up and ready for fluid. Got a brake line hooked up, running over here to our caliper. Got a banjo bolt through it. Now this banjo bolt here has an integrated bleeder on it. This is the only spare banjo bolt that I had for this style caliper. It's got a different thread diameter and pitch to it than the standard stuff. So I've got these tightened down. I've got this bleeder tightened down. I'm not going to use it. And then on the other side, we've got the bleeder that I'm going to use, and I've got this 90-degree elbow hooked up to it with a hose clamp for a little extra insurance. And then that has a line running down to the reservoir for the pump, and then on the other side of the reservoir is the pump, and we're going to pump that up to apply pressure to pull the brake fluid all the way from the master cylinder through the line, through the caliper, and into the reservoir. And that'll get everything filled with brake fluid really quick. And then back over here at the caliper, in preparation for the actual bleeding of the brakes, I've got a piece of aluminum stock that's in between the brake pads. It's about the same thickness as an actual brake rotor, and I've just got that in there so that the brake caliper and pads can clamp down on that, and they won't clamp down all the way against each other. That way I don't have to use a screwdriver or something to try and pry the pads apart whenever I go to install this thing. So how it's going to go is, I'm going to take this cap off, leave it off. I'm going to fill the master cylinder up with .4 brake fluid. I'm going to come over, give the pump a few squeezes so that it builds some vacuum. Then I'm going to slowly crack the bleeder open and let that vacuum pump pull the fluid through. And the entire time I've got to be over here watching the master cylinder, because as the brake fluid level goes down, we'll have to keep this full so that as the vacuum pulls the brake fluid through, this becomes empty, it's going to start pulling air through. and we don't want that. Now, this whole process is a whole lot easier with 2 people. That is, if you got somebody over here washing the master cylinder, filling it up continuously, and you've got somebody over here working the brake bleeder. It is doable with just 1 person. It's just a little harder. It takes a little bit longer. You have to continually shut the bleeder off, go back over and check, refill, come back over, crack the bleeder open a little bit, and continue. Okay, here's everything after we've done the priming process. The setup did work pretty good. And now that everything's primed, I'm just going to leave this all hooked up. I'll relieve the pressure out of here. And we'll start pumping the master cylinder and finish bleeding it. See if all of our new seals work. We get some good clamping pressure in the caliper. Okay, just finished up bleeding this completely through. And how we completed getting pressure into the brake system. We filled the master cylinder up all the way with brake fluid, put the cap on and tightened it down. We made sure our bleeder bolt was tight. And then we took this and pumped it. And usually you do this with a brake lever, but on the bench, just kind of held this thing and pushed it up and down to work the plunger up and down. As you can see, this thing's got a pretty good bit of pressure in it now. And after pumping that quite a few times, while holding this down with pressure on the plunger, come over here, crack the bleeder open real quick and then tighten it back down. And then came back over here, started pumping again. Every few times, open up the master cylinder, refill it with brake fluid using this little funnel. And we made a mess, but found out that our master cylinder rebuild worked. Brake caliper rebuild worked. It's got good pressure. With the master cylinder down, I'm not able to pull this guy out, so it's got good clamping force. And then without this guy down, I am able to pull that out, so it's not sticking. So we're good to go. So that's pretty much it for today's episode. Hopefully you learned something. If you liked the video, hit the subscribe button, tell all your friends about the channel, and as always, in between episodes, you can follow me on social media at Hot Boys Racing on Instagram, and then for our ATV drag racing page, you can search on Facebook, Hot Boys Racing. I'll stick links to both of those in the video description. Thanks for watching.